The presentation will explore certain key dimensions of the Belt and Road Initiative. Throughout, the focus will be on challenges it is or will be facing, as well as possible solutions and opportunities connected to them. With an analysis of the political and economic infrastructure related to the initiative as a basis, the topics of political stability and connectivity will be examined in the light of the countries involved. This will be done with a case-based approach, using examples to highlight aspects of significance. And lastly, a comprehensive look will be had at the implications of economic integration, which can be considered to be a major driving factor behind the initiative, before arriving at our conclusion. The success of the Belt and Road Initiative will depend on efficient governance, as its implementation is affected by factors such as administrative architecture, legal framework, regulation, and funding. The following part of the presentation will attempt to further examine these factors. China has not proposed an international or overarching architecture to coordinate the Belt and Road Initiative. Rather, China intends to use existing institutions to strengthen cooperation and coordination, in addition to vehicles such as memorandums and trade agreements. Without an overarching architecture to promote transparency and efficiency, the initiative is prone to the risk of inefficiency, corruption, and conflict. Thus, it could benefit from a coherent governance architecture involving all potential participants, a formal mechanism for cooperation and coordination. This could also serve to reduce corruption in countries targeted by the initiative by introducing regulated multinational institutions to their economies. The diversity in legal systems and practices found amongst the countries involved in the Belt and Road Initiative may give rise to issues regarding trade and cross-border investment. A solution to this issue could be to find some form of common legal ground where disputes can be settled fairly. What is more, dispute resolution mechanisms today are incomplete in terms of appeal, compensation, or mediation and reconciliation in cross-border investments, disputes, and rulings. In fact, building a fair, all-round, and workable dispute resolution system for international trade and investment is an important task for governments and legal professionals. Thus, the Belt and Road Initiative certainly presents the opportunity to establish a more secure environment regarding cross-border investment. The need for coordination regarding regulation can be split into two groups: practicalities like measurement, certification, and statistics, and economic regulation related to competitive practices, tariffs, and government influence. If these regulatory aspects are not planned for and coordinated accordingly, calculations and thus profitability will be affected and projects might be slowed down. One solution to this risk might be to negotiate bilateral and multilateral agreements regarding investment barriers, investment protection, and standardization. This could also be viewed as an opportunity to strengthen the economic infrastructure of Belt and Road countries. The initiative will be funded by multilateral institutions like the newly established Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, as well as China-only institutions such as the Silk Road Fund. One challenge regarding funding is that the demand largely exceeds available investment funds. However, more resources can be directed towards Belt and Road projects if China repays what it owes various multilateral development banks and minimizes its new borrowing. Not only would this strengthen China's roles as a creditor, but it would also signal the shift in its role from an international agenda follower to an agenda setter. Another challenge is whether the China-only institutions will operate outside established standards and safeguards regarding the environment and fairness to affected parties. This reduced transparency regarding legal framework and regulation can be said to increase the scope for corruption. It should be noted, though, that an overarching governance architecture could solve this issue.
This part of the presentation will talk about some of the One Belt and Road implication and risk, namely the security risk, labor risk, and the infrastructure risk. For the security risks, most of the One Belt and Road projects are conducted in some less developed countries where security problems may arise. One of the examples to illustrate the security risk in One Belt and Road is the Great Port in Balochistan. Balochistan is experiencing constant terror attacks which causes damages to the infrastructure built there. China has to deploy an additional 15,000 troops to protect its infrastructure there. We could see that development projects in volatile areas would increase the development costs and pose a security risk to the One Belt and Road initiative. Labor is one of the essential factors to the realization of the One Belt and Road initiative. It is very important to make sure that there are sufficient labor to carry out the One Belt and Road projects. One of the examples to illustrate the labor risk would be the East Coast Rail Line project in Malaysia. Malaysia has persistent shortage of skilled labor to carry out the One Belt and Road projects, and China has to export Chinese workers to foreign countries to tackle with this problem. However, it may pose a challenge to China because she has to comply with all the foreign labor regulations whenever she needs to export Chinese workers to foreign countries. On the other hand, this may create job opportunity and reduce the unemployment rate in China. Before deciding where to develop a One Belt One Road project, China should make sure a place has enough funding and utilities to support the operation of the infrastructure to minimize the infrastructure risks. High-speed railway in Venezuela could be an example to demonstrate this risk. Venezuela is not a suitable place to construct and operate high-speed railway as it constantly experiences electricity deficit and it does not have enough funding to support the development of this One Belt One Road project. If an infrastructure could not be fully utilized after construction, we could see an infrastructure risk from that.
So this part will focus on political rivalries between our countries. Rivalries are diverse and complex, and for these reasons we have decided to only discuss the Chinese case. So politically, the Ober project is an opportunity for China, firstly, to strengthen its global image as a powerful country independent of other powers, and secondly, to increase its political connectivity with other countries. However, these opportunities may be threatened by political rivalries. The first example discussed is the Chinese and Indian one. Firstly, China and India are giant neighbors. Secondly, each has a population of over 1 billion individuals. Thirdly, these countries have divergent political views. China has an authoritarian government, whereas India is characterized by its democratic vibrancy. Therefore, as China and India are both global powers and their interests extend further regionally and globally, they consequently come into conflicts. And in addition to that, we should note some conflicts regarding borders. Therefore, the challenge will be to go beyond these distances to build a constructive, fruitful, and effective relationship between them, but also to join their resources in order to gain more power globally. The second most relevant example of rivalry is the Chinese and the Filipino one, also known as Asia's most toxic relationship. The major reasons explaining their rivalry are rocks, islands, but also fishing zones and hydrocarbon resources. Therefore, the main challenge is to go beyond this rivalry and build a strong relationship that will benefit each country. Finally, the potential French presidential elections won by Marine Le Pen could affect negatively the economic and political relationship between China and France. To conclude, the Ober initiative has been created to boost China's influence in Central Asia, in Europe, and more broadly in the world. As a growing number of countries become more dependent of the Chinese transports, economy, and energy infrastructure, China itself becomes more powerful. And from this point of view, it is interesting to ask if the Ober project is a way to gather countries and increase connectivity between them, or to increase the political gap between countries, leaving China at the top. Cultural diversity occurs in many fields such as language and religion. Therefore, the cultural diversity of Ober countries may be a competitive advantage or, at the contrary, act as a barrier. For example, English is the language that dominates the international business communications. However, many countries still communicate in Russian, Arabic, or even Persian. Therefore, this diversity could make communication more difficult.
This part of the presentation will examine some implications regarding the economic integration that is expected to happen through the Ober initiative, focusing on trade liberalization, financial integration, and macroeconomic risks. Increasing trade liberalization with other countries is a large motivation for China in the development of the Ober initiative. In a report issued by the Chinese NDRC in 2015, China expressed its belief that the Ober initiative could and should inspire motivation for trade and investment liberalization. An important factor is the improved infrastructure and as such the creation of global value chains, as it will be essential for Asian governments and companies to investigate how the opportunity of integrating into regional and global value chains can increase trade and investment. A more liberalized trade with Asian countries also has the possibility of creating an outlet for Chinese overcapacity, as well as creating new markets for diverse Chinese products and services. Other developing countries in Asia can benefit from China reducing their barriers on trade by being able to export their products. Creating free trade zones is also expected to increase market flexibility in the region, enabling economic actors to respond to new types of demand in different places. In the same report from the NDRC as discussed earlier, the Commission highlights financial integration as an important underpinning for implementing the OBOR initiative. The general importance in this regard will be for all Asian governments and economic institutions to improve multilateral financial cooperation. One factor to consider is the flexibility and the economies of scale benefits that arise from developing large financial institutions. Harnessing the unique experience and expertise from the domestic institutions of other countries is likely to be a profitable consequence of such financial integration, and could also help develop mechanisms of addressing cross-border risks and crises. Increased financial integration would also give Asian countries more alternatives regarding equity and debt requirement. A challenge tied to financial integration is that most Chinese banks are comparatively less experienced in cross-border and international transactions. In addition, where developed currency markets in countries along the OBOR corridors are expected to get crucial boosts from the initiative, countries with less developed financial markets will face difficulties. One factor to consider in regard to macroeconomic risks is that China will be faced with higher macroeconomic risks in the countries they're expanding trade and investment in. In addition, Chinese investments turning outward instead of inward could have a large impact on their economy as firms used to massive public funding might struggle. Another interesting macroeconomic factor is the possible internationalization of the Chinese RMB as an Asian currency, as the Chinese government sees the OBOR initiative as an opportunity to surpass the US dollar and Japanese yen as an investment and reserve currency. Another risk is the possibility of a crowding out effect, where the government activity necessary for the OBOR project suppresses private investment. A solution here might be to organize effective public-private partnership project to stimulate private competition and industry, as well as bringing in the needed government funding. To summarize, there will be challenges connected to the project that needs to be considered. However, the OBOR initiative still has the potential to create vast business opportunities through its investment and integration. To what extent the countries involved manage to harness these opportunities as well as consider the challenges will be the deciding factor to the success of the OBOR initiative.